Rancé, as I was saying to you before, did not have an easy abbacy. Part of it, as I said before, was his own fault, and some of it wasn't. There was inevitably, of course, the conflict with the, I'll use the term again, Common Observance, who regarded his reforms as a direct and unnecessary attack on their whole way of life. It, in fact, was not quite that, but one can understand why it was thought to be that. And the other three major problems, that major controversies with which he was involved during his abbacies, were the three that I'm going to talk about now. One of them more important than the other two, although all of them are relevant, as you'll see, relevant to some extent to the present day, one of them particularly so. Now, the first was a controversy with a former friend of Rancé. His name was Guillaume le Roi, William the King, Guillaume le Roi. He was a commendatory abbot, but one of the good, solid, devoted commendatory abbots of French abbey called the Abbey of Haute-Fontaine. And in earlier and indeed happier days, he'd been a friend of Rancé. He'd spent time with Rancé at Véretz when Rancé was pondering his future. And when Rancé had eventually moved to La Trappe, he'd been welcomed at La Trappe and actually stayed there with Rancé. They had walked around the lakes together at La Trappe, lakes, I might add, which I walked around myself with Dom Marie de Bois when he was abbot of La Trappe, and may he rest in peace. And the dispute, this first dispute, centered on what was called, the technical term was humiliations, not humility. Humility is a different matter. Humility is the essence of the monastic life. Indeed, as St. Augustine said, there are three steps to the vision of God. Humility is the first step, humility is the second step, and humility is the third step. But this is humiliations, which is a different matter. What do we mean by this? It was one of the techniques which is used at La Trappe for training the monks, and it is a dangerous technique. I'm going to quote now Rancé. A vigilant and loving superior would take care to train a monk by reproaches, sharp reproofs, stinging words, public embarrassment, hard work, and degrading occupations. And even if a monk tries to do well, tries desperately to do well, and perhaps does well, the superior will always find there something to criticize. Now, one, you can see what's at the back of this, and two, you can see why, in fact, it's not really going to work. What's at the back of it? Well, the back of it is, as Rancé makes perfectly clear, and as Bernard made clear, and as Benedict made clear, and as the whole monastic tradition makes clear, the eradication of self-will. The eradication of egocentricity, the eradication of I-ness. This has to be rooted out, so that because of the principle that the less self-will, what I want, the less self-will there is, the more room there is for God's will in us. So that eventually, if we can totally eradicate by grace and only through grace self-will, then we'll be doing God's will entirely. We'll become, like Athenagoras of Athens said in the 2nd century, a flute on which God plays, except that there's really a little bit more to it than that, because this flute on which God plays, the flute, which is such, actually contributes to the playing. This is the key feature in it. We don't just become puppets in God's hands, we become cooperators with God in the work of creation. It's an awesome responsibility. But we can't do it if we're full of ourselves. So we have to, as all the monastic writers said, they made it clear, self-love, self-will has to be destroyed. And Augustine, who sometimes said some things which are quite wrong, and sometimes said some things which are quite marvellous, identified love as will. For him, they were the same thing. He says, love is vehement will. So love, in fact, for Augustine and for the Cistercian tradition, for the whole monastic tradition, love is not a sort of slushy pond of romanticised warmth in which you fall. Love is something at which you work. You work at loving. And our relationship with God is rather like an arranged marriage, as it were. You don't know who the bridegroom is because the bridegroom is unknowable. And so you're face to face, or you're face to something with something that you don't know anything about and you can't describe because it's beyond all our thoughts, beyond everything else. And you have to learn to love this being who is, of course, infinite and just burns you up when you as much as glance at him. This is a dangerous thing to do. It is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. But we're going to try. And it is our will which will help us to do this. But if, as I said, if our self-love and our self-will is all we have, then there's no room for the will of God. In other words, there's no point in our saying every day, as we say every day, your will be done, if there's no room in us for that will to be done. We have to open ourselves up to it. So you can see what Rancé is getting at. We have to use techniques which will reduce self-will, self-love, which is the essence of self-pride, pride in ourselves, pride in what we do, pride in what we think. You know, oh, I've done this. Oh, I can do that. Oh, I've written this many books. Oh, I'm so good at this and I'm so good at the other. Things which are certainly true to a certain extent, but when compared with the perfection and the infinite capacity of God are, of course, as nothing. So we have to be reminded of where we stand, namely that we are images of God, more about that in a minute, but we are flawed images of God, or in monastic terms, we are images of God, but the likeness has been lost through sin. And sin, for the most part, is not really hard line, malice, maliciousness, but very often the result of straightforward, simple stupidity. But we're in a situation in which in which our self-will and self-love is there, there's no question about that, and we have to devise means of reducing it and ultimately, by grace, if we can, removing it. All the Cistercian writers and all the monastic writers are clear on this point. So you can see where, as I say, where Rancé is coming from. You do something and he will then say, oh yeah, but you didn't do it, to reduce your pride in it. He will say, yeah, but you didn't do it to this extent. You didn't do it quite as you should have done. You don't say, oh, I sang really well, I chanted really well in choir today. Yeah, but you are off in the B flat in the third tone when you're actually doing this. There's a problem there. So you, in other words, you put them down. But if you put them down all the time, there is, of course, a problem here. It reminds me, in fact, of a Sufi story about the great Sufi teacher, Pir, who found her a luxuriant and wonderful beard. And he could not make any progress on the spiritual path. He kept getting stuck. He would get so far and then couldn't make any progress. And God, who is most merciful, he is in Islam, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the merciful, compassionate, called the angel Gabriel and said to him, look, go and tell this particular teacher the reason why he is not getting anywhere on the spiritual path is because of his pride in his beard. Because he would anoint it with oil every morning and comb it and make sure it looked very beautiful, just like Father Lawrence's, and myself, every morning, trim it here and trim it there, just to make sure it's absolutely gorgeous. And so the angel appeared to the sheikh in a dream and said, this is God who says, and the sheikh, oh, of course, said the sheikh, of course, said the sheikh. Every morning from this time on, I will pluck out 3 hairs from my beard until my beard has entirely vanished. And so he began to do so, and so it went on. So it went on and on and on. His beard was becoming reduced, but he could make no progress on the spiritual path. And God, who is merciful and compassionate, called Gabriel and said, look, go back to this particular Sufi teacher and tell him the reason why he is not making spiritual progress on the spiritual path. And the archangel said, Master of the universe, what should I tell him? And God said, it's because of his pride in plucking out his beard. And so sometimes you criticize, and then this pseudo humility creeps in. Oh, I can't do anything right. Oh, this is wrong. Oh, this is wrong. Oh, this is wrong. And you start to take pride in being as debasing yourself, crawling around on the ground, debasing yourself, and forgetting that you're in fact an image of God. Even though we may be a flawed image of God, we can't ever afford to forget that we are images of God. Male and female created him ad imaginem Dei, to the image of God. We haven't achieved that imageness yet, but we are it. Now, the problem with humiliations can be likened in a certain way to the plucking out of the sheikh's beard, the Sufi teacher's beard. It can lead to a pride in abjection, a pride in humility, a pride in humbling oneself, a pride in despising oneself, which it's not Christian. This is not what Jesus of Nazareth said. Jesus of Nazareth did not say, I want you to despise yourself. He said, I want you to have life and to have it more abundantly. So there unquestionably was dangers in this, and more to the point, what happens, and this is where Rancé's friend Guillaume Leroy comes in. Guillaume Leroy saw this and said, so what happens if in fact a monk does something? I'm talking about monks here, you could say monks and nuns if you like, but Rancé's talking to his monks. What happens if a religious does something which in fact is as good as it can be? You then look for something to criticize. Even if it doesn't exist, said Guillaume Leroy, if you do that, you are creating what technically were called fictions. In other words, the superior who accuses a monk or a nun of doing something, criticizing them for something which in fact they have not done, simply to put them down, is, using a technical term, lying. And lying is a grave sin. Now, Rancé never actually goes that far, but if you actually read his long, of course it's long, letter on humiliations, you can understand why Guillaume Leroy thought that this was the case. There are occasions when it does look as if what Rancé is doing is creating non-existent faults. He is in fact, as I said, lying, which is of course a serious sin. And Guillaume Leroy wrote a long letter, that is to say, a book of about 200 pages, short for the time, to Rancé, explaining and condemning him for this. Rancé, of course, who, as we know, did not take kindly to criticism and took great offence at any criticism at all, wrote an even longer rebuttal to Guillaume Leroy, his former friend, saying why he, Guillaume Leroy, was wrong and why Rancé's technique of humiliations was not in fact what Guillaume Leroy thought it was. There was misunderstanding on both sides. Neither side came out particularly well. Christian charity, the spirit of Christian charity, was noticeably lacking on both sides, and the technique of humiliations continued as a trap. There's no doubt there was a dangerous technique. There's no question about it. Rancé was, if I may say so, I think wrong in this. But there it is. That was the first major controversy. It did not come to any particularly satisfactory conclusion. It didn't. The principle behind it, reduction of self-will and pride in oneself, absolutely dead on, and Rancé says that again and again and again in all his works, and especially in his conferences. We have to reduce self-will, we have to reduce self-love. He's right. He's absolutely dead right. There's no question about that. That is the key to this spiritual path, the abolition, eventually eradication of self-will. But the technique used in this case is unquestionably, I'm sure you'll agree with me, a dangerous technique. It is now, as far as I know, not used at all, and that is right and proper. The second major conflict, of less consequence in a sense, was with another man, a superior, this time a superior of the very austere Carthusian order. Now the Carthusians were very, as you know, very, very rigid indeed. They lived, well, a mixture of the hermit and the cenobitic life. They lived, as they do now, in their own apartments, and they meet together on fairly rare occasions. And any of you who have seen the movie The Great Silence will know how the Carthusians live now, as they lived in the Middle Ages. It used to be said that the Carthusians never reformed because they were never needed to be reformed. And there's no doubt that they were and are an extremely austere order. I remember Abbot Thomas Davis of Viner on one occasion, when he was abbot, seeking if he might possibly visit a Carthusian monastery and stay for a while, and they wouldn't let him in. They wouldn't let him in. No, but they still are just as austere as they were. But Rancé, when he is criticising the various orders for laxity and for falling away from their rule, suggested very delicately, I must say, which is sometimes unusual for Rancé, suggested quite delicately that the Carthusians also might have been in need of reform. Now, the general of the Carthusians, that is to say, the superior of the Carthusians in France at this time, was a man called Dom Innocent Le Masson, L-E-M-A-S-S-O-N, Dom Innocent Le Masson. And he was a man very much like Rancé, very literate, very well educated, read French, Latin, Greek with absolute facility and ease, dedicated to God as he interpreted God, an overdose of self-righteousness, which Rancé undoubtedly possessed himself, did not take kindly to any criticism, particularly the Carthusians, and he erupted like a pious volcano. And he went for Rancé viciously, pointing out how Rancé's comments on the Carthusians were wrong, how they were totally wrong, how they were completely wrong, and furthermore, he included some very critical comments on Rancé himself. Well, talk about lighting the blue touch paper and standing well clear. As I mentioned to you, Rancé did not take kindly to criticism, especially criticism of this nature. So, from the one eruption of the Carthusian volcano, there followed in 1689 the eruption of the Cistercian volcano. And he replied to Dom Le Masson with, of course, a long, verbose letter, which was equally intemperate, just intemperate, and pointing out in no uncertain terms why and how Dom Innocent Le Masson was wrong. Dom Innocent Le Masson replied, of course, by showing that, no, this was not the case, and Rancé was wrong. And so the quarrel degenerated. It went on from bad to worse, and eventually it became so public, it came to the ears of the king himself. And in 1689, the king himself, Louis, intervened and forbade any further discussion between the two differing parties. He silenced them, in other words, not the Pope, not the Bishop, but the king himself said, enough, that's it. And in fact, by royal command in 1689, the production of the pamphlets, i.e. books, ceased. But you can tell from letters which were and comments made at the time by Rancé and his contemporaries that the conflict, the controversy was still sizzling under the surface even 7 years later. Rancé did not always exhibit the Christian charity of forgiveness, which in fact an abbot should exhibit and which Rancé preached. But then, of course, what I have to remind people is that Rancé was only very human, as indeed we are. Indeed, I have been known myself to err and fall by the wayside. But that's what we have grace for, and that's what grace is needed for we abundant sinners. So that was a nasty conflict, an extremely unpleasant conflict. Neither side, again, showing the Christian charity they should have done, neither side coming out well. But in fact, that one was pretty well limited to the time and the place. It was limited to the time and place. If we can learn a lesson from it, it's a lesson which, in fact, we say in each day in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses, not as we forgive others, but forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Forgiveness is not just a one-way channel from God to us. We are forgiven if and as we ourselves forgive. That we do not see in this unfortunate conflict between two rather self-righteous, self-opinionated, bloody-minded men who had to go at each other.